project was conducted in collaboration with Alejandro Vasquez at the University of the Republic of Uruguay. In this study, we are taking interest in academic performance of undergraduate university students. First of all, in terms of academic achievement, meaning grades, but we'll go beyond that and also consider their feelings of belonging within the university and also the degree to which they like and feel comfortable with professors. When we look at the determinants of these three different academic outcomes, we're going to consider the framework wherein personality traits, the most distal factor, would lead to more proximal factors such as time perspectives and motivation, which would in turn lead to academic outcomes. So first, we're going to investigate direct relationships between sets of determinants and academic outcomes. And then we're going to look at two different types of indirect effects of personality traits on academic outcomes. So either through motivational dimensions, or through time perspectives. There were a lot of parameters taken into account in this exploratory study, and within the scope of this presentation, I'm going to focus on time perspective, of course. In terms of methods, 265 undergraduate university students in Uruguay were included from the psychology and engineering departments. Self-report questionnaires were administered that tapped GPA, feelings of belonging within the university, feelings of belonging with professors. We took into account Big Five personality traits and another trait called need for cognition. In terms of time perspective measures, we took into account quite a few, including time attitudes, time perspectives from ZTPI, a future negative scale, and also the consideration of future consequences with two subscales of immediate and distant consideration of future consequences. We took into account 5 different dimensions of motivated strategies for learning, as well as demographic variables. So the analysis plan that I will be presenting right away, first we're going to be looking at regression, so direct effects, including these different levels of determinants, so sets of determinants, and then we're going to look to see if we can identify some significant indirect effects in order to explain the relationship between personality traits and academic outcomes. In terms of results, when we take into account these sets of determinants, first of all, it's interesting to know that motives explained the most variance across determinants, followed by time perspectives, time attitudes, then personality traits, and lastly, the consideration of future consequences. We ran regressions with different sets of instruments as predicting a GPA, feelings of belonging, and belonging within the university. I've put the results up here for you, and I won't go into too much detail, except that it's interesting that past positive, low past positive was related to higher GPA. And another interesting fact is that we see the future that comes up quite a bit within this academic context. In terms of indirect effects, so we were only looking to explain direct effects, meaning there needed to be the presence of a direct effect in order for us to elaborate a mediation model. For personality traits, we found that high conscientiousness was related to GPA and that low openness was related towards attitudes towards professors. And we only drew up mediation models if this X to Y relationship was true, so personality to outcome, and also that the X was related to M and M was related to Y on the basis of these regression analyses. This led us to draw up 4 multiple parallel mediators models using process. The first was through motivation. We found that the relationship between conscientiousness and GPA was explained by self-efficacy. We found, when we looked into time perspectives as potential mediators, we found no significant indirect effects. So the relationship between conscientiousness and GPA was not explained by time perspective. When looking at the relationship between openness and attitudes towards professors, we found an interesting case of competitive mediation. So openness by itself would lead to disliking professors unless the person is studying for intrinsic value motivation, which is interesting, albeit not related to time perspective. When we look at time perspectives as potential mediators of this direct effect, we found no significant effects. Again, in terms of the discussion, a few points. First of all, it was a strength of the study was to look beyond just GPA and investigate these feelings of belonging, both because it's important for students and their well-being, and also the individual differences that were taken into account in this study were actually better related to these feelings rather than success in terms of actual performance. Another point is the importance of specific measures. So as you can see, we took into account a lot of different measures of time perspectives, and in some cases, like with GPA, we only found the ZTPI future dimension to be related, but similar constructs such as the CFC or the TAS were not significantly related. On the other hand, there were other instances where, for example, whatever the instrument may be, the same sort of construct was reliably related to the outcome, which was the case for feelings of belonging in the university, for example. This low pass positive, be it measured by the TAS or the ZTPI, being related to higher GPA is indeed surprising. Generally, pass positive is a good thing. One hypothesis could be that when people are focusing too much on getting a higher GPA, they were not engaging in very many positive pleasures in the past, and so when they're going and looking back onto their experience of all these different years studying and being super focused, they have a harder time remembering the pleasurable times of their past. Maybe. Take-home message is that the relationship between personality traits and academic outcomes is explained by these motivational processes, at least in part, notably intrinsic value and self-efficacy, and is not explained by dimensions of time perspective in this study. Negative results. Some conclusions, limitations, future directions. Limitations, this study was self-report, relied on cross-sectional data. The reliability, especially of the ZTPI short scales with only 3 items, was low. About 0.6 sometimes. A take-home message for time perspectives, again, is that they are related to feelings of belonging in GPA, but they were not identified as significant mediators of the relationship between personality traits and these academic outcomes. Future directions could look into indirect only mediation. So we only elaborated mediation models if there was an effect to be mediated, but indirect only mediation is definitely a possibility. And another possibility, which is actually quite fruitful, is to look at subjective time as a distal factor leading to these same academic outcomes through motivational processes. So motivational processes would be the underlying mechanisms explaining the relationship between time dimensions and these academic outcomes. And that is indeed the case. We wrote up a paper on this, which was recently published, and I've put the reference here for you. Oh, here are the references. And thank you for your time.
Thank you to the 2 Tianas. Tiana watching herself. Yep. I had the chance to watch the thing beforehand, so I know what the GPA is, but maybe not everyone does, because I had to look it up. Maybe you can just quickly tell everyone what GPA is.
Oh yeah, GPA is short for grade point average. In the United States, we use that term quite a bit, but in Uruguay, they have grades, a collective summing of grades. In Uruguay, they have a 12-point scale rather than a 4-point scale. So it's a continuous measure.
Okay, so one thing you said, you didn't find many relationship between time orientations and academic output, but this could also be a good sign, because it means even if you are hedonistic, impulsive, yeah, it doesn't have a big effect maybe on your grades. What is more important are your motives. Yeah, is that
Exactly.
yeah? Could you just say a little bit more about the motives? How did you assess that? What were the questions?
Sure. What I want to say as well is that time perspective was related to these attitudes towards professors and feelings of belonging and GPA in some cases as well. But it wasn't it wasn't an explanatory mechanism. It wasn't a significant mediator. And so this article is really looking into explaining the effect of personality traits on academic outcomes through time perspectives. So there were direct effects between time perspectives and some academic outcomes, but motivations were more central. So the motivations that were really highlighted were intrinsic value. So that means that you're studying because you really want to. You're finding the coursework interesting. You understand why you would be learning these things and how you could be using it in the future. And self-efficacy was also an important one. So that would be feeling that you can succeed if you try. So believing in your capacity to achieve in the university setting.
So Raimonda, you wrote a half an essay as a question. Maybe you want to unmute yourself and ask the question. Or Tiana, can you see it? Maybe
I've just clicked on it. I can read it.
Can you just repeat the question maybe? And then so that everyone hears it. Oh, Raimonda's there. So maybe she can ask the question directly.
Yes, I think I can read it.
Yeah.
Okay, so I also found it interesting that low past positive was related to higher GPA.
Yeah.
And you explained it through having not very positive memories about the past, while students had to study to get higher grades, right?
Maybe.
Yeah, possibly. And another explanation came to my mind, so I wanted just to share it with you. And isn't it possible that those who got higher GPA already had their views towards the past somewhat not very positive, and therefore, let's say, wanting them to change their future led them to study harder and then get better grades?
Oh, maybe. So that would be the case of someone who had a lot of negative experiences in their past, and then they want to focus on the future to get a better situation, a better life. That's a great explanation. Thank you for the proposal. I had a really hard time explaining it, and I checked the results multiple times because I thought it was so strange. But seeing it across two instruments, and maybe there's something there.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you.
So again, please feel free, unmute yourself and ask questions. So my next question would have been, maybe others, if you don't find certain correlation which seem like obvious, but then you don't have it, is it maybe that the students are something like a specific group where the variance of the is already smaller, because they're all students, they're all studying for a certain purpose, yeah? And then maybe you don't have this variance you would find in a bigger group of subjects.
That's a possibility.
So you get a ceiling effect or something, yeah?
It's a possibility, because all of the students who were there were enrolled in the university. They were mostly in first or second years, so they could drop out later. But it might have been a too homogeneous group.
And they were all psychology students or from any department?
No, we had about half of psychology and half from engineering. So that was another bit of a biasing.
But that's a big variance, psychology students and engineering students.
Yeah, with a lot of women in psychology and a lot of men in engineering.
Okay.
So that would be another mix-up variable as well.
Did you ever look at the possible differences?
Yes.
Male engineers and female psychologists.
Yes, yeah, I wrote up an article on it. It's still under review it's been quite a while, but yes, there were differences depending on if it was engineering students or psychology students, and it looked like it was more the field of study that was counting rather than the gender of the participants.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Can you give us just a few highlights?
Highlights. It's been a while
of the results.
Yeah, so for motivations, for example, the predictive power of within each domain on GPA, for example, was not the same. So the traits that would get you ahead in engineering were not synonymous with those that were working well in psychology. I think intrinsic value was working well in engineering, but was unrelated in psychology.
Mm-hmm.
So there were quite a few effects to that effect. Another one is that the psychology students were, personality traits were much better related to academic outcomes among the psychology students, and the engineering students, there were much fewer significant associations.
Okay. Well, are there any other questions? We still have the chance to talk to Tiana live now. Ask her questions. Unmute yourself with any questions you might have, any pressing questions. Okay, so thank you, Tiana.
Thank you.
For a lovely talk and about Uruguay students and their motivation to study. And so we'll turn to the next speaker, so who is Isabel Winkler from the University of Chemnitz, and she'll do a study I like very much, waiting, what happens with subjective time while waiting, and that's what we all face every day. So please, we'll have a look at the next video.
Welcome everyone. My name is Isabel Winkler. I'm from Chemnitz University of Technology in Germany. And the study I will present today is on factors of time perception while waiting. The study was done by my students, Sarah Blum, Alena Engel, Katja Stäglich, and Jacqueline Winter and me. Yeah, let's start. Let's start with the theoretical background. Waiting is something we do quite a lot, and waiting can trigger emotions like anger, anxiety, and frustration. And the waiting experience affects behavior and maybe decisions and buying decisions. And the perceived length of waiting is negatively correlated with customer satisfaction and perceived quality of service. So a long perceived waiting time can cause serious consequences, not only for organizations, also for interpersonal relationships, of course. But however, sometimes waiting times are inevitable. It raises the question, what can we do? Of course, an option is to influence the perceived waiting time. So the passage of time, feeling of passage of time. And we find a lot of studies on waiting situations in the literature. And there are several factors discovered influencing time perception. So the most famous ones are, of course, in the attentional gain model by second block, arousal. The more aroused people are, the longer is the estimated duration. And the more attention they pay to time, the longer the estimated duration. Also, boredom affects time perception in a negative way, meaning the more bored people are, the longer is the perceived waiting duration, and the slower time passed by. Fairness and comfort are factors influencing the waiting duration in a positive way, meaning time feels by passing faster. And another important factor is the expectation of waiting duration. So there's a contrast effect, which means that the longer duration people expect to wait, and it actually doesn't take that long, it feels as time passed by fast. These are factors which change in different situations. But then we have also person factors, traits. And two of them are negatively correlated with the speed of time. Impulsivity makes people feel that time passes slower. And boredom proneness. The more boredom prone people are, the slower they have the slower they experience that time passes by. The more future oriented they are, and the more they consider future consequences, the faster time passes by in a waiting situation, and the more temporal metacognition abilities they have, the slower is the felt waiting duration. The method we used is an experience sampling method, meaning we had an online questionnaire, and at first we presented some trait scales, and then we told the participants whenever they experience the waiting situation within the next 14 days, they have to go back to the survey and answer some questions about this special waiting situation. We had 80 participants, mainly psychology students, which caused the high number of female participants and the young age. We measured, of course, the big five: impulsivity, temporal metacognition abilities, their consideration of future consequences, and boredom proneness. And we had 598 waiting situations of our 80 participants. The duration range was 3 minutes, at least minimum was 3 minutes waiting time, but no longer than 2 hours. And for each waiting situation, we measured passage of time judgments on a rating scale from 1 to 7. 1 is very slow, and 7 is very fast. And the subjective duration from short to long. And as expected, we found a high negative correlation between the two judgments. Yeah. And we let the people rate 22 situational characteristics of the waiting situations. For example, their attention, their emotions, available information, how comfortable they felt, how much control they had over the waiting situation, their fulfilled expectations, familiarity of the waiting situation, and other items. So what are the results? We calculated multi-level analysis, one for the passage of time judgment and one for the subjective duration, and results are quite similar due to the high correlation. So I'll present only the calculations for the passage of time judgments, and we checked for multicollinearity of our predictors. So we had to drop self-control because it was highly correlated with impulsivity and stress. because the high correlation to arousal and time pressure. These are the results. So we had 6 significant factors. The longer the wait was than expected was the most important factor, which caused a slow passage of time. And the more bored they felt and the more attention they paid to time caused slow passage of time. And then we have 3 factors influencing time perception in the other way. So how comfortable they felt caused fast passage of time, and the perceived fairness and also time pressure caused a fast passage of time. The trait factors didn't have an impact, at least not a significant impact on the passage of time. Probably because the waiting situations differ that much more than the difference between the participants. So if you have to make people wait, the best advice is to make them expect a long waiting duration, longer than it actually takes, and to avoid to make them feel bored and don't pay attention to time. Make them feel treated fair and comfortable while waiting. And I have 2 questions to discuss. So one is whether the results depend on the kind of waiting situation. Does it make a difference between waiting rooms, queues, waiting for a bus or train, waiting at home or waiting virtual? And of course the study was done in times of Corona last winter at the end of the year. And yeah, does Corona have an effect on the time perception? These are the references. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Isabel. I already asked Isabel this before, and I just knew I have to ask this as very first question, because I think everyone else will also want to know it. How did you do this cool presentation with which software?
Prezi. Prezi video.
Perhaps you can type it in the chat box or something. So then you can just create it like you presented very easily, yeah? So it's, you don't have to have any programming skills, or it works, yeah?
No, it's just like a PowerPoint. So it's
Okay.
it's a little bit different. So you have to get used to it, but it's yeah, it works. So.
Okay, very well, good. Yeah, so another, just looking into the chat box, so also Egle also wanted to ask the same question as I had, so I was right. Yeah, so anyone, again, chat box, I think also it's you can just unmute yourself, ask questions right away, because this is of course pressing for everyone every day. What happens during waiting? I was just I stumbled suddenly. I wasn't sure. I thought you had just asked about the passage of time. Did you also ask about the duration? A question about duration?
About subjective duration.
Subjective duration. How did you do that? Because there are people in this method. People are anywhere. They could be in the station. They could be in the taxi, in the car, walking somewhere, and then they get suddenly beep beep on their cell phone. Yeah.
No. It was not a signal-based method, but rather an event-based method. So whenever they had a waiting situation, then afterwards they should go to the survey and type in, fill in, complete it.
Okay, very nice.
So because we don't know when people are in a waiting situation.
And then, so normally, so you have like a classic situation, you have a certain event and you know objectively it takes 20 minutes, let's say, and then people have to judge the duration. And they say 15 minutes, 25 minutes, and they can underestimate. But in this case, how did you do the duration measure?
It's not time estimation. We made people rate the subjective duration. So just on a rating scale from short to too long.
Okay,
so we did it not in minutes or something. Yeah, that didn't make sense. So because they knew how long it took, and they should type in when it started and and type in when it ended. And we let them know beforehand that they should, even if they sometimes if you wait at the doctor's waiting room, you cannot type in, you cannot complete a questionnaire. So we made people write down on a piece of paper the starting time and the time the waiting ended. So we had the objective duration. Yeah. And then later on they could type in all the other answers to the items, all the other ratings.
Okay. But this also, I think, explains why you did not see any differences between passage of time and this duration estimation. Because somewhat they were similar, the questions and the related answers.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, but still, I mean, it could have made a difference, but it almost didn't. There was one factor I didn't mention in the presentation because I didn't have time, is the actual duration. It was not a significant factor for passage of time, but for the subjective duration, which I found interesting. So it seems that the subjective duration is a bit more maybe correlated to time estimates, but I don't know. So there are small differences.
Okay. Okay, so thank you. Isabel, are there any more questions from someone else?
I actually had one. Hi, Isabel. Hi, everyone. Excellent study. I am also very interested in studies on waiting time, waiting situations. And actually, I had the same question which you already answered. How did you make people to wait for 2 hours? But now I understand everything. So just congratulations with an excellent study. Good job.
Yeah, and I mean that's the good thing about this study. To use an experience sampling method, you have the real waiting situations. You don't make people wait. We have done some studies too in our lab before Corona times, and made people wait. But it was always, I found it's always a bit artificial, and it might be, the results might be different. Sometimes it didn't work out as I expected it, and I thought maybe it's because of this artificial waiting situation, and then you use a cover story, but people, I mean, in our university, they might tell other participants, so it's hard to do it. And actually, this study we came up with because of Corona, so we couldn't go to the lab anymore, so we had to come up with a different method. And I find this experience sampling method really appealing.
Also, that it's event related, so it's first the event and then people answer, so it's the other way around as usual.
Yeah, exactly.
It's very interesting because, well, really in lab, you cannot make people wait for 2 hours, you know, like you cannot leave them for 2 hours and say, you know, just wait. People will just leave, go away, who will wait for 2 hours. Yeah. So nice.
But there are, of course, limitations. It's exactly what you're saying. They might not just wait. So we made a good instruction, and we defined what we mean by waiting times, waiting situations. But I mean, we also asked for qualitative data, what did they do while waiting, and what did they wait for? What was the situation? And but sometimes you have the feeling they do all different stuff. Like when I think about your one of the studies, Mark, you did with Miss Witowska.
Joanna Witowska,
yeah. Then the people were forced to stay in that room, and they couldn't do anything else but reading.
No, there were no books, no watches, no cell phones, no books, nothing.
But they read some instructions on the
individuals.
On this Feuerlöscher. I don't know the English expression of it, but yeah, here people of course do different things while waiting. And the discussion question I had was the corona also affects the waiting situations people were experiencing. So we just said you have to wait for something you can't control when it happens, and you have to be aware that you are waiting. So and you cannot act on what you plan to do because of this waiting. That was the definition. And but it was interesting to see what they did. They did all stuff, eating, reading, but that's how life works, of course. It was funny to read all these answers. And yeah, that's one thing. So they do things, and the other thing is due to the corona lockdown, the data were from December last year, so it was a lockdown situation. And they were mainly, a lot of situations were at home. So we didn't say if you wait at home, you cannot complete the questionnaire. We took all waiting situations, and so that might impact. That might have an impact, and I don't know how. So it would be interesting to do the study again after Corona, if everything is hopefully normal again. And yeah, it was also funny to see when they had real waiting situations. It was for a Corona test, or it was because they could not go into a store because they had to wait because only so and so much people could go inside. It was all affected somehow by the Corona situation. And yeah, that's the question, how the results would be yeah, in another life situation.
Okay, so we have a final comment, but it's just a comment by Egle. I do think it's interesting to study consumers. It moved waiting time during sales in supermarkets, etc. So that's just a comment. Yeah, that it actually has an application. And I'll just read now. Just when I was saying this, I thought final comment. So now a final comment by Marina. I'm thinking on how this waiting experience corresponds with the procrastination practices. Can we consider that people can put themselves in the waiting experience while they procrastinate on purpose? So waiting can be so desirable even to become an addiction. Okay, so that changes around the game. Okay, but that's maybe another thing to think about. Yeah, so maybe you suddenly like waiting because you want to avoid an outcome. And so let's have this as a final comment for tonight. And thank you, Isabel. Thank you, Tiana. And see you these days on this screen somewhere else. It was a nice session. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you all. I was glad to see you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.